And this time we're talking about the other end of the workflow. And if you guys haven't heard about IMF, you will hear about IMF.
Yeah. I was thinking we actually did this backwards. We probably should have done IMF first and then this one, right?
Well, actually, people start thinking upstream. They usually think downstream.
It's backwards,
Yeah.
reverse engineering.
Okay, so our speaker today is Annie Chang. She's a VP of Creative Technologies at NBC Universal. She is also has been the SMPTE chairperson that helped bring the IMF standard into light. And I'm still not seeing the file.
It's getting there. It's getting tired, like all of us. This is a lot of information, huh? We've been kind of cramming it all in. Okay, so I'm hoping to I'll just try to start talking. Hoping to continue the fun with container formats can actually be fun. Started with Thomas there, so thank you very much. So I'm happy to be here. We're going to talk a little bit about the interoperable master format, so not the International Monetary Fund, although this was a little bit of the possible mission for us. And for those of you who have seen my 2012 SMPTE webinar a long time ago, some of the beginning part will be a little familiar of this presentation, but I promise you the rest of it's pretty different. So what we're going to do is we're going to cover a brief history on IMF and then bring everybody up to speed on what's actually been going on with IMF, including some things that might be interesting to the broadcast, cable, and OTT sector. And then we'll actually do a deeper dive into IMF, and to try and keep things lively, I'm trying to shock you guys into a couple of things that are different with IMF, but I'll explain kind of like why it's that way. All right, so let's get into it. So IMF could also stand for It's My Fault. In 2005, I was actually transitioning from THX to Disney. And I was working with Pixar on the original Cars movie, and we were doing it for DVD. And they decided to actually try to do it file-based. And although it was just NTSC and PAL resolution back then, we were using uncompressed DPXs. It was super unwieldy, really giant, really incompatible and non-interoperable. So I started thinking about like, well, you know, what would be really cool is like, you know, Pixar had all of these different language versions, and we really needed a better way to do file-based masters. You got to remember back then it was all tape-based, right? Remember back in 2005 when like HTK MSRs, Digibetas, and D5s. So basically, I started talking to the Disney folks about it. In 2006, we went up to Pixar and talked a little bit with them and said, hey, we really should try and figure out this mastering file format thing. A really smart guy up there named Rick Sayre, who's the TD actually on Incredibles 2, said, well, why don't you do something like digital cinema? So at the time, for those of you not familiar with digital cinema, the standards were just starting to come out at SMPTE. It was using JPEG 2000 and MXF, and there was actually a lot of versioning capability. And we were very comfortable with that idea. We were like, oh yeah, duh, why don't we do something like digital cinema packages? But then we quickly just decided within Disney that it couldn't be a Disney proprietary format. We needed to exchange with other vendors and post houses. We needed actually some interoperability, needed to maybe even give a master over to another studio. So in 2007, we started talking to other studios and going, hey, what do you think about creating this file format, which we do. And of course, when you try and get any group of people together, different companies, there's always that question about antitrust and collusion and all that. So in 2008, the University of Southern California Entertainment Technology Center had created a safe homeroom that we could, all studios could talk and discuss about the actual file format in an antitrust type of environment and that sort of thing. Originally, it was called the Digital Video Package, or DVP, and then somebody at Paramount said, no, let's change it to interoperable master format, and that's what ended up sticking. So, of course, when you get multiple companies together, I'm sure many of you guys know, it takes a while to actually get anything done. So about 2 or 3 years later, we actually published the version 1 of this IMF specification through the USC ETC. And we had sort of primed SMPTE ahead of time to let them know that this document was coming as an input document. So really quickly, the next month, SMPTE actually started work on IMF. And as Yasser mentioned, I actually got to be the first chair of this IMF effort. And I had no idea what I was getting myself into, but now I can actually run for political office. So it's all good. The SMPTE work started happening. And of course, SMPTE doesn't just rubber stamp things as things go in. We were all comfortable as the studios going like, yeah, let's do JPEG 2000. We'll do something like just kind of constraining the digital cinema spec. And of course, other folks at SMPTE were like, wait. We don't want JPEG 2000. We want actually another codec. And actually, it's particularly one company, we were basically kind of at a standstill, headbutting. In April of 2011, actually just a month later after we started the effort, we decided to actually, in order to get past the impasse, we came up with this concept, which actually ended up being actually a pretty good idea, I think, in the end. But the idea was to have this core framework that we would have all the major constraints, like the fact that we're using MXF, for example, as the wrapper. And then this idea that I'll talk a little bit more about composition playlists that actually create the versioning and everything. So all that would be in this core framework. And then we would actually create these modular applications that would basically slot into the framework and allow you to actually solve specific issues or problems and functionality. So you could use different codecs, for example. Maybe you have different resolutions or frame rates and that sort of thing. But it is the interoperable master format. So we did specify that you had to be able to be interchanged and interop within the application. Not between applications, but within it. So that was kind of the key. So that actually helped the impasse at SMPTE. And so we ended up with two different applications. Application number 2, which was a JPEG 2000 based application up to HD resolution, because at the time we were just doing HD. And then another application, which was called number 3, which was the MPEG-4 Simple Studio Profile up to 4K. And that's also loosely known as the HDKMSR codec. So you can kind of imagine perhaps what studio or what company that was kind of, but it's okay. We're all friends now, so we're all good. It's cool. And you may be asking yourself, like, well, what happened to application number 1? So originally, application number 1 was going to be an uncompressed application, but as soon as we started talking about mezzanine level compressions, we were kind of like, well, why do we need it uncompressed? So right now, application 1's kind of just been this sort of dead space, and so it's kind of just sort of reserved a little bit. Basically what ended up happening is that, so we had this application number 2 and the application number 3. In 2016, the bunch of the proponents for application 2 created this extension, when we called it extension E. So it's application 2E that basically extended the JPEG 2000 application to 4K resolution. The big thing was it included SMPTE ST2084, also known as PQ. Oops, bless you, perceptual quantizer for HDR, and so that was a big add to that application. And so that's actually what a lot of the studios are using right now when they make their IMFs. Also in 2016, the French cinema folks came up with application number 4. This was another JPEG 2000 variant, but they actually needed some different functionality in the J2K, so they created their own application number 4. And about that time, what was very interesting is Apple and a few other proponents wanted something that was very similar to application number 2E, but they wanted ProRes instead of JPEG 2000. But because ProRes is in a standard, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, they created something called RDD, or Registered Disclosure Document 45. And basically, that's application number 2E with ProRes. So I'll talk about that in a second. Also, just this year, another application came out. It's using ACES, the Academy Color Encoding System. That's a color management pipeline for a lot of the way we create our content for both episodic and feature content. But what the Academy of Motion Picture and Arts and Sciences wanted to do is they had this great image format that was a standard, but there was no way to really wrap audio and subtitles to it. So they decided to incorporate the ACES image format into IMF and then create application number 5. So that actually just came out, and that's meant for an archive master. So these are all the published applications right now. Also, just to let you know, there is, and we'll talk more about this, but there's a technical specification that's being worked on right now by the Digital Production Partnership in the UK and the EBU. And that's a constraint, basically, an RD45 that's specific for the DPP. And like I said, we'll talk about that because I think that there might be some interest here in like what they're doing and how it would actually work here. So the interesting thing about IMF is that it was started by the movie studios to basically solve an issue with the versioning capability and the stuff, excuse me, that we had on the movie side. But because now it's basically just for any kind of content and it's got that flexibility with the applications, you can really just use IMF for lots of different things and kind of create your own applications. So let's talk a little bit more about RD45, because it's actually very interesting. So as you guys know, ProRes is not a SMPTE standard. And so for SMPTE standards to be around, you have to standardize on other standards. But what you could do at the time was create this registered disclosure document. And so as mentioned, Apple and some other proponents were actually very interested in application 2E, but with ProRes. And so what they had to do was some legwork ahead of time. They created an RDD 36, which was the syntax and decoding of ProRes. Then they created another registered disclosure document 44, which allowed for the wrapping of ProRes into MXF, because obviously normally it's in QuickTime, which is also not a standard, but MXF is used by IMF. And then using the other couple of documents from the application to IMF suite, which was the core constraints document, which is 2067-2, and application 2E, which is 2067-21, they created this new beast called RDD45. They did take away some functionality that ProRes just can't do. So for example, application 2E specifies you can do 16-bit RGB. ProRes can't do that, so they just took that off. But interestingly enough, this was released last year, and the manufacturers have actually started creating the ability to create RDD45 packages. And so there was a Plug Fest just recently over in Munich from SMPTE Plug Fest, and there was a pretty good turnout of manufacturers to create the files and interchange them. And they're working on the report, so I actually don't know what the results of that Plug Fest are yet. But we'll be hearing about that probably pretty soon. So our RDD45 was created, and then what ended up happening is the EBU and the DPP over in the UK were interested in constraining RDD45 even further, and at the same time, SMPTE was creating a new engineering document called the technical specification. And so this is sort of the first use case of the TSP. Where the DPP is creating a document actually that will be published over at SMPTE. And it's basically constraining the RDD45 to the use case that the DPP needs. So includes all this wonderful stuff. The key difference, I think, with the DPP document is that they also wanted HLG, hybrid gamma for HDR. Hybrid log gamma is not actually standardized yet in application 2E. It's being worked on, but obviously that standards work takes a little bit of time. So this is actually a quicker way for the DPP to actually get a specification out there and include HLG, since that's already specified in BT 2100. So that's kind of the latest of what's been going on. So we're going to talk a little bit now more about IMF and some of the differences between kind of like what we've been doing and kind of like we're doing now with IMF and why. So we'll start off really high level and then we'll jump off the building there. So IMF is actually meant for a business-to-business use, so it's not meant for consumer, which is why I was saying, I was like, maybe it makes sense like we did this one first and then do the BFF, the ISO one next. But anyway, so this is really meant for the business-to-business kind of use case. It is meant from a high-quality, file-based final master that has lots of versions. So obviously, we're including image, audio, subtitling, captioning, technical metadata, playlists, and all that stuff that we normally need for the program. But the key is with IMF is like it's all about the edits, right? So SMP edits, language versions, all that stuff. If you have a lot of versions, this is where IMF is super powerful. It does minimize storage because the idea is you use mezzanine level compression. But the key here is that we're storing just the differences or the deltas between the versions. So no more flattened, long play, boring old masters. We've actually just got to chop everything up, right? And it is really meant for pre-created masters. So this is meant for store and forward, not really meant live to air. Okay, so that's kind of the key there. All right, so now we're going to take a look at a real-world example. And this is where I freely admit I am actually not from the broadcast or cable world. I worked in master control and I was a morning editor for a CBS affiliate in the 90s, but that was a really long time ago when everything was very linear. I actually did have some help on these next few slides, and I have to thank Andy Quested over at the BBC for letting me borrow his slides, but I felt they would be more relevant for this crowd than anything I could actually put together. Some of you may have seen this before from Andy, but he had this sort of Doctor Who use case. So Doctor Who is a very popular series. I'm sure some of you guys know that, from the UK. And for the 50th anniversary, they decided to do a worldwide simultaneous release in both television and in the cinema. So what they did for the television side is they made a whole bunch of 2D HD versions. They also made a whole bunch of 3D HD versions in 5 different languages for the TV side. Then for the cinema side, they did 2D and 3D digital cinema packages in 24 different countries. So adding up all the storage use case that they had, assuming that each of the versions were about 77 minutes long, their ProRes TV versions ended up being about 4 terabytes in total. The cinema versions were about 67 terabytes in total, which meant that pretty much they were about 70 terabytes for all of their different versions. But unfortunately for them, 90% of their material was duplicated a bunch of times, right? Because it's the same common pieces in a lot of the bits. So they did an estimate, and they figured out that if they were to have gone IMF with this release, they would have saved a ton of space. So for the television versions, it was about 90 gigs for the IMF. For the cinema versions, it would have been around 2.6 terabytes. So really, it was just slightly over 3 terabytes of total information for the IMF version of it. So you might be asking yourself, like, what? That sounds crazy. How did they actually figure all that out? Well, the key is really getting rid of all of the redundant areas, right? Just keeping the common pieces. So what that means, and this is where we have to let it go, folks, we have to get used to not having a single file for our program masters, right? So this is where it gets scary, because we're talking about components. But we've been hearing about components all day, so I think you guys are used to it. So the idea is you have a single core asset. All your common pieces are your core there. And then you keep all your delta clips, anything for the alternate version. So this could be like different logos or a regional difference in the image. It could be your audio languages. It could be your subtitle files. And the thing with IMF is the way it works is that all of those essence files are wrapped in MXF. And then you have these XML structures or files that basically describe the content. We'll go into more detail here, but you'll have like XML that has a playlist for it. You'll have these other XMLs that actually describe the shipment of them and everything. And so there's a bundle of files, basically. And so when you're shipping these around, you might be asking yourself, like, well, how do I do this exactly? You would actually ship around an interoperable master package, or IMP. So you can kind of think this as a bundle of files here. It's basically a bunch of MXFs and XMLs. And the key here with IMF is basically you have your essence files that are repped in MXF. So you have your image with whatever codec for your application. You have your audio, which is usually a WAV file that's wrapped in MXF. You have IMSC1 for the subtitling files. And then some metadata track files. And those are all like either XML or MXF, depending on what they are. Then you have this XML that refers to it and brings it all together to create the version, or what we call the composition. And that is the composition playlist, or CPL. And so that's the sort of first section that you see here on the left-hand side, is that CPL that points and references to all those different essences. And then on the right-hand side, we have a couple other XMLs here, and we're going to focus on the bottom two there. For shipping, you have something called an asset map and a packing list. The asset map basically is a mapping of the files that you have inside the package to their location inside the little bundle. So if the bundle's like a zip file or a folder or on the hard drive or whatever, it kind of explains like where everything is in the folder structure. The packing list is just like your packing list on an Amazon box, right? It tells you exactly what's inside the shipment and gives all that information over to the receiving end. So let's really dive into it now and give you an example of what the bundle actually looks like. So it's basically just a folder structure with a bunch of files, a bunch of MXFs and a bunch of XMLs. And everything's kind of listed in. You could arrange them however you want. You could be in the root. They could be in like folders if you want. It's however you want. But you will notice that the file names are not really superhuman readable. They're a bunch of letters and numbers. So here's broadcast shocker number 1. We actually don't use file names or file paths. So instead, we use UUIDs. So yes, thank you, right? Come on, we're gonna wake up, guys. Come on, I know, it's hard. It's been a long day. So yes, files with no human readable file names. I know, again, let it go. I used to work at Disney, let it go. You know, you can sing the song, okay? What we do is we use universally unique identifiers, or UUIDs. So all the MXFs and all the XMLs use those. And the really reason being is that IMF is actually meant for a computer and machine system, right? We've got to get away from the human readable stuff. So you do need an IMF aware system that can basically ingest these files and register them and manage them for you and know where they're at and that sort of thing. Because it's the only way you can kind of deal with a componentized system is that you need a system that's actually smart enough to understand where they're at. And so that way you can automate the storage of them and the retrieval processes and everything. So don't be scared. And the other thing too is you have to remember, I mean, human readable file names, they kind of suck. Right? I mean, it's like everyone's trying to put like this 256 character name in there. It's got like everything metadata about that piece of content, you know, in the file name. It's ridiculous. You have everything that starts with like episode 1, blah, 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 or opening titles, blah, blah. I mean, it's ridiculous. We have to actually get away from that and try and get to this point where you actually ingest the files. So, how would you find them and that sort of thing? So there's basically this, the composition playlist refers to everything as UUIDs. When you ship around this IMP, that packing list and the asset map are actually what tells your ingest system, hey, I've got all these files, ingest these in, here's all where they're at and everything based upon the asset map. And then your system registers it and creates, you know, the locations and everything. And, you know, this way you don't have to worry about the breaking the links of the file paths and all that other stuff because your system is basically keeping track of everything. The key with this idea here is this allows you to actually send what we call supplemental or version files. So the idea is, let's say you sent off the English version. It's got like the full version of it in there, and you sent the English IMP. Then you need to send the Canadian-French version off, right? Well, so let's say maybe there's just like maybe a little Canadian-French distribution logo at the head. There's a new composition playlist that ties everything together with the old English files that you actually had, since that's the common pieces, and then maybe ties in the new French dubbed audio. So all you have to do in the supplemental package is you're sending the French audio, this little logo thing, and the new CPL, plus a new packing list and a new asset map. And that packing list says, I have these files, but then they'll notice that in the CPL, it's actually referring to these other files from the English package, which you've already ingested. So hopefully that makes sense, like the reason why you actually have this idea of like registering these assets instead of just having file names. And just to kind of show you sort of like the relationship of things, the composition playlist and the packing list would actually have the same UUID information that they're referring to certain assets. You know, and you have to remember now, the UUIDs are actually not generated by a human person. It's generated by the IMF tool. So you don't have to worry about trying to create these UUIDs by yourself. All right, so we're now going on to the next broadcast shocker, and that is the fact that we don't use timecode. Mind blown. Yes, I know, it's crazy. Now, the reason why is because timecode is so linear. You know, it's like with IMF, we're trying to do components, right? We're trying to jump around and do kind of cool things with the versioning and everything. So for example, where absolute timecode does not work great for you is, let's say we have two versions of the same program. You have a continuous version, and then you have one with commercial blacks, right? So if you had a captioning file and you're using absolute timecode, you would actually have to have 2 different captioning files, right, for the different lengths. With IMF, the idea is it's all based upon the actual component and the version. So you would actually just use the one captioning file and then insert your commercial blacks in a smarter way so that you don't have to actually factor that in the overall length of the program. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this no timecode thing, because how could that possibly work? All right, so in IMF, all of the assets have a 0 start time. Okay, so that's sort of like kind of like the key sort of thing there. And then in a version or a composition, the CPL basically gives 3 pieces of information. It gives you the assets location inside that version, so as a count from the start of the version. So basically you have like, where does my little component actually start in this version of the program? Then you also have the endpoint of the actual asset or the component, starting with the start, from the start point of that asset. So basically, it could also be not the first frame of the file. You could have like, something that has maybe the head and tail kind of leader, and you actually want to just kind of cut into it a little bit further, or maybe have some black at the head. So the idea is you have the endpoint of the actual asset or the component. And then you have the duration of that asset that will be used inside the version based upon the start of the asset. So for any of you old tape editors out there, you'll actually find this as a familiar 3-point edit. It's very similar to the idea of having the endpoint on the edit tape, and then the endpoint and the duration of the source tape. So that's basically how the edits kind of work with IMF. So it's kind of an old school idea. The composition playlist does count in something called edit units. And so what an edit unit is it's basically the smallest time unit for each of the assets. So the edit unit defines the asset duration and the position. And so, for example, on this image here, we have, we'll go into a little bit more, but we have like 2 different resources that are creating this version of this program. So the edit unit is the smallest time unit. The edit rate is the frequency or time base of that edit unit. And so video and audio actually has different edit rates. Video is usually the frame rate. So it could be like 24, 25, 50, 60. It could be a fractional frame rate, 5994 or 2997. And then for audio, it's usually the sampling frequency, so usually 48 kilohertz. The key is for IMF is that a composition or a version actually cannot mix different frame rates and can't mix different sampling frequencies on there. And also the thing is that it actually has to have the exact same duration between the image and the audio for the actual composition. So kind of looking at this a little bit further in here, you'll see that the edit units obviously get really, really big because you're just counting up all these tiny little units. But what this is trying to show you is like, let's say you have for this version with the 2 resources or the 2 different pieces, is that you have let's say the first one is just kind of a continuous 2-hour piece. But then let's say the second piece is actually 1 image, but then it's broken up into 4 different audio chunks, assets basically that are tied together. So the idea here is like everything has to add up together. So that you have the sum of the video frames equals the sum of the audio samples. So in the end, for example, the audio edit units at 48 kilohertz for 372,067,200 edit units is actually the equivalent of 2 hours, 9 minutes, 11 seconds, and 10 frames in 25 frames per second. And I do apologize for leaving this in 25 frames per second. I just kind of carried this over from Andy's thing, but it felt like it was easier to kind of explain in whole frames as opposed to doing it in fractional frame rates. But hopefully that makes sense. But IMF obviously supports 5994. You just take the 60,000 and divide it by 1001 and all that stuff. So this concept of no time code is kind of weird, I know, but I mean, we have to kind of get away, again, let it go, in order to get away from more of the linearity of time code into something that's much more chunkable and like, things that we can actually version and that sort of thing. So now that I've blown your minds, let's summarize a little bit. So IMF really did start as a standardized file format for movie industry, but it now I think has the functionality for pretty much any industry that needs versioning. The flexible versioning and the different codecs could actually be, are now enabled through the idea of applications. It does break away from our traditional workflows, right? Because now you have a bundle of files instead of a long play master, and there's no time code. But I think it's really necessary in order for us to keep pace and to keep that flexibility that you need to have for all of the crazy version explosion that we have now. And then IMF does require an IMF-aware system for ingest and for asset management. But the kind of cool thing is that at SMPTE, there is now a very flexible way of creating your own application or technical specification from IMF. And that actually helps to document what you're doing, just like the DPP is doing. And then that way that can provide interoperability and that sort of thing that we all really want to have in our worlds here. So now I can take some questions. Feel free to contact me as well. Also, if you're interested more in this, please join the SMPTE effort. That would be 35 p.m., which is the Media Packaging and Interchange Technology Committee. There are several drafting groups that are active right now. Audio Essence is actually looking at an immersive bit stream that could actually be used from a standard standpoint that could then generate into Dolby and DTS. There's the document maintenance group, which because there's a lot of different standards that are now being updated. Obviously, the DPP application's happening. And it's something we didn't talk really about, but the output profile lists, or OPLs, it's actually a global set of instructions that can act upon a composition. That's actually getting some ground there. And then, of course, there's a very active PlugFest group that works really hard to try and make sure they maintain interoperability with all the different IMF applications that are out there.
I had to walk around. So, thanks.
Thank you. And sorry if I wasn't talking into the mic very well. I don't think this was actually, I just realized.
I'll do an advertorial. The SCTE just got a presentation in their mezzanine working group from Bruce Devlin.
Oh, good.
And the hood is up on the mezzanine spec for interchange of programming among cable and head ends and program providers. So there was interest both in advertising exchange as well as long-form programs such as VOD and all that sort of stuff. So it is timely for the SCT and cable crowd.
Thank you. And Craig was part of the original IMF effort a long, long time ago, too. Actually, a lot of us were in here.
You got a trophy.
You got a trophy? Wait, I didn't get a trophy. What?
Great talk, Annie. Has there been any interest in an application supporting HEVC for the video?
Yes, actually, there has been a lot of talk, but nobody's come forward with one. I think it was NAB 2014 maybe or something. I think somebody actually, there was some interest, I think, from Amazon and some of the broadcasters. And it's totally, I mean, it's totally available. So obviously the key, you probably are aware at SMPTE, is it's really driven by proponents. So there's no reason why anyone that's actually really interested in it can't do it. So, and there has been talk about, typically the IMFs are interframe, but there was talk about trying to create something that was GOT-based. So, it's totally possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's, with the various profiles up to 16-bit, 444 intra.
Yep.
Could be lossless, so a little more efficient, I think, than J2K.
Yeah, I mean, it's totally possible, but it's just, yeah, I mean, obviously no one's going to do the work for you. You gotta have proponents and then push it. But yeah, definitely.
Okay, any more questions out there? All right, please give a round of applause.